Andrew Foster had never cared much about being noticed. At Aurelius Pay, that made him easy to overlook. He was 34, a senior systems engineer by title, though the title barely captured what he actually did. If you passed him in the hallway, you probably would not stop twice. He dressed like someone too busy to think about clothes, always a little tired, always carrying the faint look of a man who had gone one night too many without proper sleep. There was almost always a cold coffee somewhere near him, abandoned halfway through, because something more urgent had pulled his attention away. To newer employees, Andrew seemed ordinary. Reliable, maybe. Quiet. A little older than the younger technical hires who liked to sound smarter than they were. But the people who had been inside the company long enough understood something different. Andrew knew Aurelius Pay's infrastructure better than anyone alive in that building. He understood the ancient API layers that were still holding together systems leadership kept promising to replace. He knew which security patches had been improvised during past emergencies, which failover routines were stable only in theory, and which parts of the architecture were connected by fragile logic that no one had documented because no one wanted to admit how messy it really was. Aurelius Pay was not the kind of company that could afford mistakes. It processed corporate payments, wire transfers, and transaction authentication for thousands of clients across the United States. The company's infrastructure did not just support the business, it was the business. If the system paused for a few minutes, clients panicked. If it failed for an hour, millions of dollars could be at risk. If the wrong failure became public, reputations built over years could collapse in a day. Andrew knew that. He lived inside that reality. Outside work, his world was much smaller and much more personal. He was raising his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, alone. His wife had died after a long illness a few years earlier, and since then, Andrew had rebuilt his life around 2 priorities: take care of Chloe and keep life stable enough that she never had to feel how much was being held together behind the scenes. He was not the kind of father who talked grandly about sacrifice. He just did what needed to be done. He showed up for school forms, groceries, bedtime, work, bills, and the endless small things that keep a child's world intact. He did not spend energy trying to win people over at the office. He did not make himself visible in meetings. He did not know how to turn competence into personal branding. He simply worked, then went home. At the top of the company, a very different kind of pressure was building. Olivia Bennett had just taken over as chief executive. She was 29, sharp, polished, and genuinely capable. People who dismissed her as a family appointment underestimated her. She had earned strong credentials, built a reputation in investment strategy, and spent years proving herself in rooms where people were already prepared to doubt her. But leading Aurelius Pay was something else entirely. This was not a strategy deck or a boardroom model. This was a live, aging, high-risk machine full of hidden weaknesses and institutional habits no one had properly untangled. Her grandfather had stepped back because his health was declining, and Olivia had inherited not just a title, but a test. She knew people were watching for weakness. She knew some expected her to fail, so she came in with force. In her first week, she announced a sweeping operational review, tougher standards, and what she called a cultural reset. Her message was clear. The era of comfort was over. Accountability was in. She moved quickly. She judged quickly. And more than anything, she hated visible disorder. What Olivia did not yet understand was that deep inside Aurelius Pay's infrastructure, beneath the language of accountability and leadership, something had already started to go wrong. 2 days before Olivia's first morning, officially running the company, Andrew noticed a pattern in the transaction authentication logs that did not belong. At first, it was subtle. A low-frequency cluster of irregular requests inside the international processing queue. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud enough to trigger automatic alarms. In fact, that was the problem. The requests were designed to look normal. They mimicked the timing and rhythm of legitimate internal traffic so precisely that the company's filters ignored them. But Andrew did not. He kept tracing. The more he looked, the worse it became. Someone had gotten into a secondary service at the edge of the architecture. A lower priority authentication relay connected to a narrow slice of cross-border payment verification. From there, they were carefully probing deeper. Not smashing through walls, learning the building, testing access, mapping what could be reached, what could be touched, what could be used later. This was not random interference. It was patient, intelligent, deliberate. Their goal was clear enough to Andrew, even before he could prove every detail. They were positioning themselves for the right moment. A high-volume window. A time when the company would be under pressure, and a disruption could create confusion long enough to redirect funds, corrupt reconciliation, or disable detection long enough to make the damage irreversible. Andrew escalated the issue through his direct manager. The response came back exactly the way dangerous responses in big organizations often do: polite, cautious, and fundamentally useless. The timing, he was told, was bad. A major incident report right before the new CEO stepped in would create alarm. Better to keep monitoring. Better not to overreact until everything was confirmed. In other words, stay quiet. Andrew did not. Not really. If the company was not going to act formally, he would act unofficially. He began building temporary containment layers by hand. He isolated the affected segments as carefully as he could without crashing anything visible. He redirected suspicious traffic through manual paths designed to absorb and delay it. He hot-patched vulnerable nodes one by one, working through the system like a man reinforcing a dam in the dark with whatever material he could reach. The challenge was brutal. Aurelius Pay's infrastructure was old in the way enterprise systems often are: layered, patched, partially upgraded, and full of invisible dependencies. There was no safe way to shut it down cleanly and fix it in peace. The system had to stay live. Transactions had to keep moving. Clients had to keep seeing stability, while Andrew fought a threat inside the machinery itself. So he kept going. Hour after hour, night into morning, morning into night. He barely left the operations floor. He survived on stale coffee, vending machine food, and momentum. At one point, he changed his shirt in a bathroom near the server room because he did not have time to go home. Colleagues saw him around constantly, but most assumed he was handling some ugly but manageable escalation. Nobody understood how much he was doing. Nobody realized the company was functioning only because Andrew was holding it together manually with knowledge no one else possessed. By the second night, he found the part that turned everything from dangerous to catastrophic. The attackers had placed a delayed activation mechanism inside the processing cluster. It was dormant, invisible under normal conditions. But if anyone performed a routine restart on the core services, the kind of restart engineers used all the time to clear memory buildup and stabilize congestion, then Andrew's temporary protective logic would disappear instantly. The hidden pathway would activate. The attack would move from reconnaissance to execution. Andrew documented everything. He wrote technical notes, log summaries, patch records, warnings, annotations, timestamps. It was not polished. It was written the way exhausted people write when they are racing against time and do not expect the luxury of revision. But it was clear enough for someone willing to read carefully. He planned to take it directly to executive leadership in the morning, if necessary. He was done, waiting for permission. He just had to make it until then. But exhaustion is not negotiable. After nearly 48 hours without real sleep, Andrew sat down in front of the main console to wait for the morning shift. Monitors flickered around him, alerts scrolled by, temporary defenses still holding for the moment. He lowered his head onto his forearms for what he likely thought would be a second, and that was how Olivia Bennett found him. At 7:45 on her first official morning running Aurelius Pay, Olivia entered the operations center as part of an unscripted tour of the company's critical infrastructure. She wanted to see the real organization before anyone could stage manage it for her. She walked past rows of screens, engineers finishing overnight shifts, and the cold, fluorescent brightness of a room built for constant vigilance. Then she stopped. At the center console, in the most sensitive part of the operations floor, a man was asleep at his desk. His shirt was wrinkled. His head was down. Around him, more than 20 monitors glowed with status indicators, amber warnings, and scrolling technical output she did not understand. What Olivia saw in that moment was not a man at the end of 2 impossible days. She saw indiscipline. She saw a symbol. She saw exactly the kind of negligence she had come to eliminate. She did not ask a single question. She looked at the badge on the desk, read the name, and said it sharply enough to cut through the room. Andrew jolted awake, still somewhere between sleep and pain, disoriented, trying to pull himself back into the world. Before he could fully orient, Olivia spoke again. This company does not pay people to sleep on the job. Every engineer within earshot froze. Andrew blinked, recognized her instantly from the leadership announcement, and tried to speak through the fog. You need to hear what I have to say about the core payment cluster. She cut him off. Not today. Then, in front of the entire technical floor, she ordered security to take his badge and instructed HR to terminate him immediately. Andrew looked at her, not angry yet, not pleading, just urgent. He tried once more. If someone restarts the system. But Olivia had already turned away. I've heard enough. Security stepped forward, and the room stayed silent. Security stepped forward, and the room did what rooms like that always do when authority speaks with certainty. It went quiet. No one interrupted. No one stepped in. No one said what several of them already knew, that Andrew had been there for nearly 2 days straight, that something serious was happening, that this wasn't normal behavior for him. Challenging a brand new CEO in her first hour would have required a kind of courage most people don't discover until it's too late. Andrew didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or try to defend himself. He didn't list what he had done over the past 48 hours. He didn't explain the attack, the patches, the risk sitting quietly inside the system. He just reached up, unclipped his badge, and handed it over. Then, before turning to leave, he looked at a younger engineer named Daniel, who had been standing nearby the entire time. He said 4 words. Do not restart it. That was it. To some, it sounded like bitterness, a final comment from someone who felt wronged. To others, it was vague enough to be ignored. And to Olivia, it barely registered at all. She had already moved on, mentally closing the moment as a necessary first act of leadership. A signal that things were going to be different now. Andrew walked out of the building slowly, his body finally catching up with the exhaustion it had been holding back. Behind him, Aurelius Pay continued running. At least, on the surface, it did. The dashboards still looked stable. The metrics were within acceptable ranges. Andrew's temporary isolation layers were still quietly absorbing the irregular traffic, doing exactly what they were designed to do. Buy time. From Olivia's perspective, nothing had broken, which made her decision seem justified. She moved through her scheduled meetings with confidence, outlining expectations, reinforcing standards, and pushing her message of accountability. Some department heads felt energized, others felt uneasy, though they couldn't quite explain why. Down on the technical floor, the atmosphere was different. A few engineers had already pulled up Andrew's internal repository folder. His notes were there, dense, compressed, written in shorthand that made perfect sense to him, and only partial sense to anyone else. There were warnings, patch references, annotations that hinted at something deeper, but without the full context, it felt like trying to read the middle of a conversation you hadn't heard the beginning of. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know how wrong. Shortly before noon, the first visible sign appeared. A processing cluster began to slow down. Transactions that usually cleared in fractions of a second were taking several seconds. Not catastrophic, not yet, just enough to create a backlog. The kind of thing that happened from time to time in systems like this. The on-duty supervisor saw it and made a familiar call. "Let's restart the service." It was routine, standard practice, a quick reset to clear memory buildup and restore performance. He had done it dozens of times. As he prepared the command, Daniel hesitated. "He told us not to restart it," he said quietly. The supervisor barely looked at him. "He's not here anymore." That was enough. In organizations, authority has gravity, and once someone is removed from the structure, their words lose weight almost instantly. The command was executed at 12:47 p.m. During the early peak of the business day's second trading window. The system restarted. For a moment, it looked like the right decision. Queue times dropped, the backlog cleared, metrics stabilized. The supervisor exhaled. Then the system began to unravel. It didn't explode. It shifted. The first signs were subtle. A cluster of transaction sessions started reporting mismatched states. Payments appeared as if they had never been initialized. Authentication tokens stopped synchronizing correctly. Services that should have been aligned began drifting out of sync. The restart had wiped out Andrew's temporary logic. The isolation layers vanished, and the dormant trigger activated. Inside the system, pathways that had been quietly blocked opened instantly. Traffic began rerouting in ways no one had configured. A portion of outbound transactions started moving toward endpoints outside Aurelius Pay's verified network. Reconciliation processes failed silently for certain categories of transfers. Nothing crashed outright, which made it worse, because now the system wasn't obviously broken. It was behaving incorrectly. And incorrectly, in finance, is far more dangerous than failure. Engineers moved quickly. They tried to roll back the restart. But the state they needed to return to didn't exist in any clean, documented form. It had been something Andrew built live, piece by piece, under pressure. They tried isolating nodes, but the dependencies weren't clear. One change triggered another issue somewhere else. They pulled up Andrew's notes, reading them out loud, trying to piece together his logic in real time. The notes were accurate, almost painfully so. They described exactly what was happening, but understanding them well enough to fix the system was another matter entirely. By the time Olivia was called back down to the operations center, the room had changed completely. The calm, controlled environment she had walked through that morning was gone. Monitors were filled with red alerts. Engineers moved with tight, controlled urgency. Phones were ringing with incoming calls from enterprise clients who were already noticing delays, inconsistencies, failures. She asked what was happening. A senior engineer turned toward her, pale but composed. "It looks like he was holding the system together, manually, for the last 2 days," he said. "We just removed everything he built." He didn't say Andrew's name. He didn't need to. Olivia felt something shift inside her, fast and heavy. "Can we fix it?" she asked. There was a pause. "We're trying." That was the answer. Not yes, not no, just trying. She asked who understood Andrew's patch logic. No one answered clearly. She asked where the CTO was and how deeply he understood the legacy system. The answers didn't help. The CTO was strong strategically, but this wasn't strategy. This was deep, technical, hands-on infrastructure knowledge, the kind that only comes from years inside the system, and the one person who had that knowledge had been escorted out of the building that morning. Olivia moved to an empty workstation and opened Andrew's repository. She started reading, line by line, logs, notes, patch references, observations written in a style that was direct, urgent, and stripped of anything unnecessary. At the bottom of the final file, one line stood out. "If I am not available, do not restart the core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack waiting to be triggered. Call me first." There was a phone number. No one had called it. Olivia stared at the screen. For a moment, everything else, the noise, the alarms, the movement around her, faded into the background. She thought about that morning, about the look on Andrew's face when he tried to speak, about how quickly she had decided what she was seeing. She hadn't misunderstood him. She hadn't misinterpreted the situation. She had refused to interpret it at all. She had decided first and acted second, and now the company was paying for it. She stood up. "Get me his address," she said. HR moved quickly, pulling from employee records, emergency contacts, anything that might be current. It took a few minutes to confirm it. Olivia called him. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. She didn't wait for a 4th. She grabbed her keys and left the building. The drive felt longer than it was. When she arrived, the neighborhood was quiet, ordinary. The kind of place where life happened without performance, where people lived inside routines instead of presentations. She stood outside his building for a moment, just long enough to feel the distance between where she had been an hour ago and where she was now. Then she walked to the door and knocked. No response. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She was reaching for her phone when the door opened. A little girl stood there, holding a worn, stuffed rabbit. She looked up at Olivia calmly. "Are you looking for my dad?" Olivia paused. She hadn't known about the child, not because it was hidden, but because it had never come up in any context that mattered to her. Andrew had never used his personal life as a way to define himself at work. So in her world, it simply didn't exist. The girl stepped back and opened the door wider. Inside, Andrew was lying on the couch, still in the same clothes. One shoe off, one still on. His laptop open beside him, screen dimly active. A glass of water untouched on the table. Empty takeout containers scattered in the kitchen. He looked less like someone resting, and more like someone who had simply run out of energy and stopped where he fell. The girl lowered her voice. "Daddy hasn't really slept," she said. "He said something bad was happening at work. He said he'd rest after he fixed it." The words were simple and devastating. Olivia felt something tighten in her chest. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't indiscipline. This was someone who had been carrying something alone for too long. She had seen the end of that effort and called it failure. She stepped closer, lowering her own voice. "Can I wake him?" she asked. The girl nodded. It took a few attempts. Andrew didn't wake cleanly. he surfaced slowly, like someone being pulled back from somewhere deeper than sleep. When he finally opened his eyes and recognized Olivia standing in his living room, there was no immediate anger, just exhaustion, a kind of tired that didn't have space for reaction. He sat up slowly, said nothing. Olivia didn't try to ease into it. "I didn't listen to you this morning," she said. "I fired you before I understood what was happening. That was my mistake." He watched her. "Quiet." "They restarted the system," she continued. "It's failing. No one can follow your patch logic well enough to fix it." Andrew closed his eyes briefly, not surprised, just heavy with confirmation. He reached for the laptop beside him, pulled up the monitoring interface, and scanned the metrics. It took less than a minute. Then he set the laptop down. He didn't stand immediately. He looked at Chloe first. "Did you eat?" he asked. She nodded. "Homework?" "Done. Mrs. Harmon coming over?" "She said she will." He nodded once. Something quiet passed between them. Then he looked back at Olivia. "I'm not going back because of the apology," he said. "And not because of the job." He stood. "I'm going back because if this breach finishes, it won't just be the company that pays for it." He grabbed a clean shirt, changed quickly, picked up his laptop and jacket, and headed for the door. Chloe waved with the rabbit. Andrew almost smiled, and then they left together, heading back toward a system that was already starting to collapse. The drive back to Aurelius Pay was quiet, not tense, not hostile, just quiet in the way things become quiet when too much has already been said without words. Olivia kept her eyes on the road, but her thoughts were not there. She replayed the morning over and over again, the moment she saw Andrew asleep, the certainty she felt, the speed of her decision. Andrew sat beside her, laptop open, already reviewing system metrics in real time. Even now, even after everything, he wasn't thinking about what had happened between them. He was thinking about the system. By the time they reached the building, the situation inside had escalated further. When Andrew walked back onto the operations floor, something shifted instantly. It wasn't loud. No one said anything. There was no visible reaction, but the energy changed. It was the kind of shift you feel when a room full of people realizes that the one person who might actually fix the problem has just walked back in. Relief, not comfort. Relief. Andrew didn't acknowledge it. He didn't look around, didn't address the room, didn't slow down. He walked straight to the primary console. Someone moved out of the chair without being asked. Andrew sat down and went to work. "Full logs," he said. "Give me current routing tables, authentication states, everything since the restart." His voice was steady, clear, focused. No anger, no hesitation, just movement. Engineers gathered around, feeding him information as fast as they could. He listened without interrupting, scanning data, connecting pieces, rebuilding the system in his mind. When the summary ended, he went silent for about 8 seconds. Then he started giving orders. Split traffic on the anomalous endpoints. Don't block them. Redirect to a controlled environment. I want to see exactly what they're doing. Mirror the outbound pathways. Track where every redirected transaction is trying to go. Prepare a failover for the high-value queue, but don't execute until I confirm. You start logging every command I issue, every single one. Legal. Contact the top 3 enterprise clients. Script it. Technical delay. Under investigation. Don't trigger escalation clauses. The room moved, not chaotically, not blindly, but with direction. Andrew wasn't improvising. He was executing something he had already been building in his head for the last 2 days. Now he was just adapting it to a system that had gotten worse than he had hoped it would. He understood it, not just how it was supposed to work, but how it actually worked, which was a very different thing. Minutes passed, then more. The system didn't recover all at once. It stabilized piece by piece. The anomalous routing pathways were identified and redirected. Instead of letting the attack scatter unpredictably, Andrew forced it into controlled channels where it could be observed and contained. The authentication layer, damaged by the restart, was rebuilt in segments, carefully resynchronized so that legitimate transactions could move again without opening doors to the attackers. 3 high-value transactions, already caught in a dangerous suspended state, were isolated before any funds could be diverted. 17 separate adjustments were made to the authentication configuration, each one closing a gap the attackers had been using. It was precise work, relentless and exhausting, but it worked. Slowly, the red on the monitors began to fade. Alerts dropped from critical to warning. Warning to stable. The system wasn't perfect. There were losses. Some transactions would need manual reconciliation. A few clients would require formal reports. The audit alone would be expensive. But the worst outcome, the one that would have broken the company publicly and financially, had been avoided. Andrew leaned back slightly when the final confirmation came through. The intrusion pathway was closed. For real this time. The room exhaled, not loudly, but collectively. People who had been holding tension for hours finally let it go. Olivia stood at the edge of the room, watching. She hadn't moved much the entire time. She hadn't spoken. She had simply watched Andrew do what no one else in that building could have done. And she understood completely now what she had almost lost. The emergency review meeting was called within the hour. Senior leadership, department heads, the CTO, and a technical liaison from the board gathered in the main conference room. The incident report was laid out in full, not softened, not simplified. The facts were clear. Andrew had detected the intrusion first. He had reported it. He had been told indirectly to wait. He had worked for 48 hours to contain it. He had been terminated before he could explain it. His warning had been ignored. The system had been restarted. And everything that followed had been exactly what he predicted. The room shifted uncomfortably. Some people began reaching for familiar language. Process breakdown. Communication gap. Unfortunate timing. The kind of phrases organizations use when they want to spread responsibility thin enough that no one person has to carry it. Olivia listened, and then she stood. "This morning," she said, "I fired Andrew Foster before I heard a full sentence from him." The room went quiet. I made that decision based on what I thought I understood in a few seconds. I didn't ask questions. I didn't listen. She paused. I was wrong. No one spoke. My decision nearly caused damage this company might not have recovered from. She turned slightly toward Andrew. "I'm sorry. Not carefully worded. Not wrapped in corporate language. Just direct." Andrew didn't react immediately. He didn't smile. He didn't soften. He gave a small nod. That was all. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't rejection. It was acknowledgement. The meeting moved on, but something had shifted. Not just in the situation, in the leadership. Over the next few weeks, the company moved quickly. There were offers, a promotion, a significant compensation increase, a new role overseeing infrastructure security at a much higher level. But Andrew didn't start with the title. He started with conditions. "I want a direct escalation path," he said. "Engineers need a way to reach executive leadership without being blocked." He continued, "I want enforced shift rotations. No one should be in a position where exhaustion makes them the only point holding something together. And finally, I want formal protection for anyone raising a legitimate risk. No penalties, no career damage for speaking up." The room was quiet again, because everyone understood what he was doing. He had leverage, and instead of using it for status or money alone, He was using it to fix the system that had nearly failed him. Olivia accepted everything, without negotiation. But the most important change wasn't written into any document. It showed up in how she led. She was still decisive, still sharp, still demanding. But she listened. She slowed down when it mattered. She asked questions before making conclusions. And over time, she learned something she hadn't known before. How to recognize the difference between people who made noise and people who quietly held everything together. One afternoon, a few weeks later, Olivia walked through the lobby and saw Andrew near the entrance. He wasn't working. He was crouched down, adjusting the strap on a small backpack. Chloe stood in front of him, talking quickly about something that had happened at school, her words spilling out with excitement. Andrew listened, fully, completely. No distraction, no urgency, just attention, and his face was different. Not the controlled, focused expression she had seen in Crisis, but open, soft, alive in a different way. He wasn't an engineer in that moment. He was just a father. Olivia stopped a few steps away. She didn't interrupt immediately. She had learned that not every moment was hers to step into. After a few seconds, she approached. Not as CEO, just as someone returning something. She held out a small stuffed rabbit, the same one she had seen in the apartment, the one Chloe must have slipped into her coat without anyone noticing. Chloe's face lit up instantly. She took it and hugged it close, satisfied in the way only children can be when something small but important is returned. Andrew looked at Olivia. There was no tension now, no distance. But no performance either, just understanding. Between them was something that didn't need to be explained. They had seen each other clearly, at their worst, at their most human, and they had moved forward anyway. No speeches, no dramatic resolution, just quiet. Real, and somewhere in that quiet, something better than before had begun to take shape. Because power, without listening, isn't strength. It's blindness, and sometimes the cost of learning that is almost everything.